This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. In today's episode, we'll take a big picture overview of Latin America's economies, including the question of how much nearshoring is really happening in the region right now.
It's not happening to the degree that we thought it would. It is happening in Costa Rica, for instance. Intel is investing a bunch there. They've got a big increase in investment in medical supplies and medical instruments and the like. So in some places, it's very clear. I think we just have to focus on what we need to do to take advantage of this.
It's that magical time of year where we pause and take stock of Latin America's economies, who's up, who's down, what the region is doing well, and where the challenges are. The World Bank, in its most recent forecast back in March, saw 1.6% GDP growth for 2024. That number is down from 2.3% in 2023, but it does include substantial variation across countries. There's some good news. Inflation is generally below that of developed countries, especially those in Europe. If you look at inflation in Latin America and you exclude Argentina and Venezuela, that number is 3.5% compared to 5.7% in the OECD back in January. We'll discuss all that today, as well as the role that more competition could play in stimulating growth, while also trying to get a bit of clarity on the trend that has been at the top of many minds when it comes to investment in the region, and that's nearshoring or friendshoring. Our guest today recently told me that there's not as much of it happening as some people think. So let's dive in. That guest is Bill Maloney. He's the chief economist for the Latin America and the Caribbean region at the World Bank, and someone who's been following Latin America for almost 40 years. Bill, welcome to the AQ Podcast.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for the invitation.
Bill, if we look at Latin America as a whole, GDP growth last year in 2023 was about 2.3%, led by Brazil and Mexico, the region's two biggest economies. This year, those big economies are not doing as well, and most forecasts are around 1.5%. It seems to me like you can either be glass half empty or glass half full with these numbers. What's your 30,000-foot view of the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean as we record this today?
Right. So normally I don't focus so much on year-to-year forecasts just because they're so much depend on our trading partners, what's going on in the world economy and the like. But I do think these low rates of growth that we're seeing in Latin America are important, not only because that's what we're forecasting, around 2.5% for the near future, but also because if you look at the 2010s, that's also what we were growing. So around 2.2%, while the world was growing at 3.1%. So Latin America has, a structural issue in these low rates of growth. And, if you look at 2.5%, which is roughly what we're talking in, it's just not enough to create the kind of social mobility we need and to make the dent in poverty in the region that we would aspire to.
I want to get into some of those challenges which you wrote about in this recent report for the World Bank that was entitled Competition, the Missing Ingredient for Growth. But before we do, I want to ask you, what is going well if you look at the region's economies right now?
So the first thing that we could even celebrate is that this is not your grandfather's hyperinflationary, volatile region the way it was maybe 30 years ago. This COVID crisis that we just went through was a second major crisis where we didn't do especially worse than any other part of the world. It used to be the United States would get a cold and we would get pneumonia. Everybody got pneumonia this time and we didn't do particularly worse. If we look at inflation rates right now, we're below the OECD, and monetary authorities, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, all responded more quickly and more resolutely than the advanced countries. That's reflecting a professionalization of our macroeconomic policy apparatus and just a general rise in the quality of the human capital in both ministries of finance and central banks. those institutions and that capability that we've got now needs to be defended because it's obviously the basis for all our growth strategies going forward. Now, the two opportunities that I think we have, the first one is obviously this movement towards nearshoring or friendshoring. Both what we've learned from the pandemic about the fragility of our supply chains, but also with the shifting geopolitical currents. This poses an opportunity for the region, if we take it, to bring some of those industries back to the region. The second major opportunity is precisely in the green transition, and that could potentially have really far-reaching implications for us. The region is very rich. To begin with, we are the greenest region in terms of electricity generation in the world. I think like 51% of our energy is generated from renewables. And that could be extremely useful if Europe goes through with its carbon border adjustment mechanisms that are going to discriminate against products which are not green. So in some sense, that green grid that we have and the fact that we have tremendous potential in terms of wind, in terms of solar, in terms of hydrogen, offers a new source of comparative advantage to export things like green copper, green industries of various types, green agriculture. It's not going to be the case that we can just ship oil around the way we used to, and any place can be a manufacturing hub. These kinds of energies coming from hydrogen, coming from non-renewables, are much less easy to ship. So that gives Latin America a new comparative advantage.
What do you see, just out of curiosity, as the region's potential rate of growth if these two major opportunities that you highlighted were addressed? I mean, if the region's growing between 1.5 and 2% usually a year now, what are we talking about? Given some of the other, issues like demographics. I mean, the region is not as clearly benefiting from a demographic window as it was, say, 10 years ago.
No, quite the reverse. Actually, that's going to be the demographic shift, the fact that we are becoming old, not just you and I, but the whole region. And the dependency ratio is we're about to hit a transition. Some countries have already gone through a transition where the burden is going to be more old people per worker than young people per worker. And that is going to restrict our labor force. That is going to put strains on our healthcare system. It's going to put strains on our pension system. And it's also going to have impacts on women's participation in the labor market because whether you like it or not, they tend to be the principal caregivers. And so a lot of people are going to be probably staying home to take care of their aging parents and all, instead of being in the workforce. So that particular aging dynamic is going to have big impacts for growth. What I would say is like countries of similar levels of income are growing at roughly double. Okay. I think that should be possible. If you look at the sources of Latin American growth and why we're not growing as fast as other comparable countries, it's a lot in productivity growth.
As I mentioned, Bill, your report this year, you chose to focus specifically on the issue of competition in the region. You called it the missing ingredient for growth. Talk to us a little bit about this and why you think it's so important.
So competition buys us four things in terms of economic growth. The first thing is it reduces the costs of goods to families and to industries, right? Because there are more players. If you're open to the global economy, you have access to different quality and better prices in general. And that's important from a poverty alleviation point of view and just generally from a growth point of view. And just building on that a little bit, the availability of new technologies by importing products and being more connected to foreign sources of production is very important. And that's something that we don't do very well in the region, this transfer of technology. The third thing is it has this effect of trimming not very efficient firms, pushing them out of the market and giving more space to more productive firms. And the fourth thing is it's a nudge to innovation, right? And if you don't have any reason to innovate, you won't. And so in many, many markets in Latin America, you'll find that a couple large companies dominate and they don't have any reason to innovate.
Well, so you've listed the potential benefits, but your report goes into some detail about why this is a challenge for the region right now. Talk to us a little bit about why competition in some economies is so scarce.
So we wind up, despite all the attempts to open economies over the last number of years, we still wind up pretty ensimismados, as we would say, pretty closed. in many ways. And one way to look at it, I mean, one metric that we offer is just, the share of the economy that is accounted for by a relatively small number of firms. And you find that, 50 firms can account in some countries for 70% of GDP. Now, is that a problem? It's only a problem if those firms don't behave in a competitive way. If Samsung, which is a giant firm in Korea, dominates the economy, yes, but is competing throughout the world and it's very aggressively innovating, that's fine. But if that's happening in Latin America, to look at the average markups in industry, how much profits, how much prices are above costs. And what we find is that Latin America has had some of the highest markups globally for the last couple of decades and continues to do that.
Like, what would you point to recognizing that there are huge differences among countries? What are these sectors that tend to suffer?
Sure, strangely, textiles often very protected. A lot of production of goods, of food products, very protected. One of my favorite examples from history was the Ford Falcon, right? This is before Argentine liberalization, that was produced for 15 years in Argentina after it was discontinued in the United States. That's just the kind of thing that when you have very high tariff barriers, you continue to produce these things which are technologically backwards and that really hold your country back. When I first went to Argentina in '88, every other car on the street was a Falcon. That's not good. More recently, in Chile, we had the case of a price fixing scheme by two major toilet paper manufacturers. And this went through the competition authorities. But all these things, again, just work against you having more dynamic economies and growth.
Now, one of the reasons this happens is that there are these powerful companies, sometimes powerful families, have good connections with governments that accounts for some of these tariff barriers. As we look, though, ahead, what, in your view, should governments do to address this challenge? Because a lot of these countries are quite small. If you look at Chile, for example, it's a classic example of a country where you're just not going to have that many companies in any given segment. Now, of course, Chile is a very open economy, so maybe not the best example. But where does the solution lie in this for you? Is it more trade liberalization, or are there other mechanisms?
Well, I think what's sort of interesting about the Chilean case is that that's a very open economy. That tells us a little bit that that particular mechanism is not as strong as you might have thought originally. One thing that I think the report focuses on, and we have two or three case studies, is on how important local competition authorities can be. And I think we provide the first strong empirical evidence about their efficacy. One case in Peru where the national competition authorities removed barriers to competition put up by municipalities within the country. And that led to increases in productivity, that led to increases in sales, and that led to increases in wages. Another case was in Mexico, where the Mexican competition authorities, we looked at a variety of cases that the competition authority brought against collusive industries or collusive firms. And we found again that productivity rose and sales rose. So those authorities actually work. Now, there's a problem, and this gets to the beginning of your question. They tend to be underfunded and they tend to not have the independence they need. Many of them, for instance, are under the administrative branch of the government. So if the president gets a phone call, he can pretty much tell them what they're going to pursue or not, right? So greater independence and greater funding is important. And behind that, understanding, as you said, that these are often very large firms with family ties, historical ties, connections to the media. They have a lot of power. And that affects the United States too. That's everywhere. It just might be a little bit more exaggerated in Latin America. And that gets you into questions about lobbying, regulation, and the like. What can we do to make politics function better?
Bill, I want to ask you about one last structural challenge before we do kind of a lightning round of specific countries, and that's about nearshoring. You and I we both participated in a conference at Princeton back in April, at which you made the very provocative statement, as I understood it, that nearshoring, there has not been any statistically significant increase in nearshoring in Mexico. And that if you look at the region as a whole, it's just not occurring at the rate that one might hope or expect. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think it's happening. It's just not happening at the rhythm that we might expect. I mean, the tariffs that President Trump put on were 6 years ago, right? Chinese wages have been rising steadily over the last 3 decades. It was 3 years ago that we got a good, or almost 4 now, that we learned how fragile our value chains were, right? So it's like we should be seeing something. I mean, if you look at the official statistics, you see that over the last couple of years, FDI, foreign direct investment in the region, has risen, but it's below what it was 10 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago. And if you look at announcements for greenfield investment, so like companies coming in saying, I'm going to build a new plant, it's not picking up that much. It's a little bit in Mexico, but it's not dramatic. And I think, reading the other print media, we're not the only people who are noticing this. And this is a bit of a puzzle because if you talk to people on the ground in Monterrey or in other places, they say, no, there's a lot of activity. The demand for industrial parks is really high. So there's a bit of a mystery what's going on, whether the statistics are missing something or whether, in fact, as some bankers told me when I asked them if they were investing in industrial parks, they said, no, there's a lot of speculation right now. We're not sure how real this is. So to some degree, we have to wait for it to shake out. I would say, I want to stress the positive aspect of this, which is it hasn't appeared yet, or it's not happening to the degree we thought it would. It is happening in Costa Rica, for instance. Intel is investing a bunch there. They've got a big increase in investment in medical supplies and medical instruments and the like. So in some places, it's very clear. I think we just have to focus on what we need to do to take advantage of this. And that is a long agenda of reforms. In some cases, in the Mexican case, we have issues in energy, we have issues in water, we have issues in human capital, we have issues in infrastructure. If Mexico is really going to play the role that I think it can play, we've got to make sure our ports are better and stronger. We have to make sure our workforce is educated better. So I think the new president has a tremendous opportunity, both on the energy front and the nearshoring front. And we're glad to work with her exactly on these areas of reform.
We'll be back after a short break.
What does AI's tectonic change mean for Latin America? Are youth losing faith in democracy? Can the region power up its lithium prospects? Latin America in Focus, a podcast of the America Society and Council of the Americas, takes on topics like these, giving context to the big issues affecting the region today. Subscribe to Latin America in Focus wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, let's talk about Mexico. What are your expectations for how Claudia Sheinbaum, the newly elected president, will conduct the economy compared to her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador?
I haven't met with her, and I'm hoping for good things. She's clearly got an interest in, for instance, climate change, and therefore the opportunities that this green transition can offer Mexico. I'm looking for that. And she also was quite effective in Mexico City in dealing with a major challenge to the region, which is organized crime and violence. If you're an investor, that matters.
Sorry, you're referring to security.
From just a point of view of the well-being of Latin America and the functioning of our democracies, the increasing influence of organized crime in places like Chile and Uruguay and the dramatic events in Ecuador are, clearly unsettling. This is a major issue, but just from a business point of view, of course, to the degree that truckers and transport people need to worry about security for shipments and all that raises costs a lot.
How big is the challenge, staying with Mexico here just for a second, of this fiscal deficit that's expected to approach about 6% this year? On the other hand, Mexico's debt to GDP ratio remains rather low. I mean, how closely should investors be watching that?
Well, I think that's a challenge for the new government. It clearly is. And as is happening throughout the region, this constricts your fiscal space and your ability to deal with a lot of these structural issues we're talking about in infrastructure and education and even security. So, yeah, there will have to be some hard decisions.
Let's talk about Argentina. Bill, as we record this, you could make a case that Javier Milei has had the best week of his presidency. His reform package was passed through Congress, albeit with significant concessions. It did get watered down. He reached a debt rollover deal with China. And then we saw the inflation number for May, which was quote unquote only for something percent. Now, that would be high anywhere else in the region, but it's actually the lowest monthly inflation number in Argentina in more than 2 years. Is the Malay experiment working?
In the short run, as you said, it's been a good week and progress is being made. And he's got a team now that has a fair amount of political savvy. And I think that's part of what we saw in this week. So I think we can, think we cross our fingers and are supportive as we can be. I think there's widespread understanding in the country that fiscal issue is at the core of this. And the only way we're going to get rid of inflation is managing that. And the only way that Argentina is going to realize its full potential is eliminating inflation. So right now, he's surprisingly popular given some of the unpopular things he's done. So let's, again, keep our fingers crossed. And
You sound cautious.
I think Argentines are cautious.
Fair enough. Let's talk about Brazil. As you evaluate the prospects for the economy this year, things are clearly slowing down. It was an economy that grew about 3% last year, but that was in part to an amazing harvest that has not repeated itself to the same extent this year. There have been some market concerns over the last couple of months about, again, this subject of fiscal accounts, which has always been, or has often been, the thing that derails the Brazilian economy when things go bad. What's your overall view of the economy as we sit here in mid 2024?
Right. So Brazil's another country that has tremendous potential. Interestingly, in the rise in FDI over the last couple of years, a good chunk of that went to Brazil, although it's not necessarily an industry. But I think in this energy transition, they have tremendous potential. I do think we're looking at 2% growth for this year and maybe 2.2 for next year. That's again low. So we have some structural issues to deal with. The government is dealing, again, they have a fiscal issue, which they're trying to bring under control. They already have pretty high rates of taxation in Brazil. So they're going to get some increase in revenues. That's possible. But I think what people are also converging on is the need for a more effective and more efficient state. And those kinds of reforms will take longer, but they're part of bringing the fiscal situation under control. I mean, I also think Brazil has opportunities for the nearshoring movement if they play their cards right.
I was surprised to hear both U.S. government officials and U.S. private sector investors make exactly that point, because we don't think of Brazil as being near. I mean, this may be an area where you have to take the term ally shoring or friend shoring instead. But the argument is that, Brazil has arguably the most sophisticated industrial base in Latin America outside of northern Mexico, and therefore that's they may be able to join in on some of this reallocation of supply chains as well.
Yeah, I think that's possible. But again, there's a lot of work to be done. Again, in education of the workforce. I just want to make this point, which is if you're leaving China, Latin America has a lot to offer in terms of distance right now, in terms of relative wages. But if you look at mathematics scores of students in Asia, or even in a place like Vietnam, they're almost 100 points above the average for Latin America. And then if you take the security situation in mind, it's a much more secure environment to work in. So distance at some level, as you were pointing out, distance isn't the key. So we have a lot to do in terms of raising the quality of our workforce, improving our infrastructure, making it easier to work in our economies. All that is homework that we need to do, both for ourselves, but also to attract FDI. And then if I can just slip this in, it's not just getting these firms there. It's learning from them and leveraging them for a more diversified development. What you'd like to have ideally is that we get high-tech firms to Mexico, to Brazil, wherever, and really good Mexican and Brazilian entrepreneurs work for these companies, engineers work for these firms and say, oh, I have an idea. And then we increase the density of firms. These become anchors, but they are not the whole enchilada, as it were. That it's a seed for a much larger industrial project. And we've not been good at the learning process that, for instance, China engaged in. It's very clear. China looked at foreign direct investment, yes, as a source of jobs, yes, as a sort of capital, but more than anything, as a source of learning, as a source of technology transfer. And we need to put that, how do we do that? And then that gets us into the question of how well linked up are our universities with the private sector. They're tied with Africa for last in the world in terms of interactions with the private sector and universities. How good is our mid-level technical stream? The things that community colleges do in the United States. No, it's just emerging. Brazil's making some progress on it. Colombia's making some progress on it. We have a whole, to leverage new foreign direct investment, but also all these opportunities in energy. We need to work on all those aspects of our innovation systems if we really want to be well integrated into modern global economy. We need to be more open, not only to get this competitive pressure, but also to get the access to the technology. When I look at the history of Latin America over the 20th century, what I see is an inability of the region to take the latest technologies that were coming out of the Second Industrial Revolution and to apply them to the mining industry, to our manufacturing sectors. And so this issue of technology transfer and the things we need to do in our countries in terms of education, in terms of the quality of our universities, in terms of the structure of our research and development support, all that, this becomes first order.
I noted President Lula's recent comments on the subject of artificial intelligence. Lula said that rich countries created AI to, quote, try to manipulate the rest of humanity, end quote. And he asked the United Nations and the International Labor Organization to help create a separate technology for the global South, he said. Hear that and listen to what you just said about countries missing out on waves of technology. And it makes me ask how well positioned the region is to harness this coming wave that we're going to see with artificial intelligence.
I think that's a very good question. It's interesting because Brazil actually has one of the deepest scientific establishments in the region. USP is the University of Sao Paulo is quite well ranked in the sciences, right? I mean, honestly, asking the UN to solve this problem is not where I would turn first. I actually think Brazil does have a lot of capability and it could participate as an equal partner in some of these sectors, but we have some reforms to do there too. We have to ensure that the incentives are right for universities, again, to work with the private sector. And we have to, ensure that all the usual incentives for excellence and all are in place.
Bill, final question for you, a personal question, if you don't mind. You've been following the region for several decades now. So hoping you could just briefly tell us a little bit about how you've seen the region change in that period and perhaps a bit of your own personal story as you've watched all that as well.
So, I think my personal story, started following the region like 4 decades ago, I think, when I was in college. Because it was a region that was thinking most about how to get growth out of developing regions. And I still think there's a lot of interesting experimentation going on in the region. I would say that first point I made about macroeconomic stability when I was leaving graduate school, everybody's writing on inflation, right? Nobody's writing on inflation anymore. Right now, we're trying to understand why we're not growing, and that is a major advance. So progress is made. There's a much greater sophistication in the discussion around development policy in terms of macro policy, and that's all a huge plus. I do worry a lot about the issues of security and crime. That is, I think, that's going to be a very hard nut to crack, and we're going to need to think, when I say we, I mean the region, but also the United States, on how we're going to work to control it. It's not a Latin American issue. This is much more global than organized crime was 30 years ago even, and that's going to require a global approach to that. So yeah, I guess I could go on, but...
All right. Bill, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
No, it's a pleasure. Good to see you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
The Americas Quarterly podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.